A cream business card lay on the workbench between a spark plug and a rag, its edges sharp against the soft patina of oil. Jacob had turned it over with a fingertip the way a man turns a coin whose face he has never seen, measuring weight, imagining what it might buy. The name printed there, Amanda Okoro, seemed impossibly clean in the grime of his life, like a promise that could not be kept. Outside, the sun made the corrugated roof glow. Inside, sweat and petrol and the clink of spanners marked the slow arithmetic of another day. If this story holds your attention, stay until the end, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest. The workshop smelled of old heat and new worry. Jacob wiped his hands on his shorts and thought of Helen waiting at home with her geometry book half open, of Miriam's jaw set like a hinge she refused to oil. He had taken the card because he had taken the money. The envelope had been thick, unmarked, and warm in his pocket like a secret. He told himself the truth. He had repaired a stalled car and been paid well. But there were evenings in which truth looked very much like permission to breathe differently, to imagine rooms with no damp marks, to think that a child's uniform might one day be ironed without argument. Miriam sat across from him at the low table in their living room with a cup of tea gone cold between her hands. The room itself was a close, patient thing. A single fan that oscillated like a tired preacher. A framed graduation photo from years when Jacob's hands were still hopeful. A small wardrobe with a stuck lock. Helen had been sent to her aunt's, ostensibly for a sleepover. Jacob had convinced himself it was better so the child's laughter would not be the witness of grown mistakes. Miriam's eyes were not accusatory so much as exhausted. They sifted through the list of failings, naming them without sound. "You should have told me," she said finally, the syllables careful as if she feared they might break something fragile in the room. "We run on one salary, Jacob, I know that. But the shame—" She stopped because shame was the one thing they both understood too well. "It wasn't like that," Jacob began. He reached for the cup with a hand that shook only a little. Amanda, she helped, she was kind, she asked my name. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Miriam cut in. Her voice did not rise, it was simple, like a blade. In her mind, every naira that slid from the envelope had bled away some of the work, the dignity of asking for jobs, of taking money for what you had done. She measured worth the way her mother had taught her, with both hands. Outside, Alhaji Musa's taxi coughed away along the dust road. The neighborhood, clustered around a cluster of stalls and a squat church, was full of small economies. Roasted plantain, phone credit, a barber shop that kept time by the wives who came to collect sons. Jacob's shame was not only private. Within hours, the whispers had begun to travel like smoke. Children at the mechanic's workshop paused longer when he walked by. A man who owed Jacob for a month of work cleared his throat and paid in coins. The ledger of respect had been unsettled. The revelation did not happen in a single moment, but as a series of small detonations. A neighbor recognized Amanda's name from a passing rumor and mentioned that she had once been seen near Victoria Island in a silver car with tinted glass. A cousin, trying to be helpful, called Mariam to suggest that perhaps Jacob had found a job in the estate. The call came with the thin offer of sympathy that never comes alone. Then Emma, drunk on entitlement and late on the phone, left a voicemail that landed in Jacob's wife's hands like a rusted nail. The family meeting that followed was thinly disguised as a gathering to discuss funds. Mariam arranged the chairs so that she sat opposite Jacob, and the room filled with those who would judge. A neighbor who kept a ledger of everyone's husband's fails. A cousin whose loyalty leaned with whoever held the louder voice. And, fatally, a woman from the church who remembered Amanda's name from news of philanthropy. The accusations were not loud, but their sharpness made no less noise. "Why would you meet such a woman alone?" the cousin demanded. "Why would you take money from someone who comes in a car like that?" Jacob answered with the clumsiness of a man who had been given a grace he had not known how to use. "She asked me to fix the car. She paid. I didn't think." "You sat in her house," the neighbor said. The word house sounded like a verdict. "You sat in her house while your wife at home cooks beans." It was not only the taking, but the appearance. The idea that a mechanic had been allowed into rooms whose floors never bore the scuff of petrol. That Jacob might have tasted a life that would not have him back. Mariam stood then, the cup slipping from her hand and leaving a brown ring. She walked to the doorway and looked at him. "If this is how you want to live, Jacob," she said slowly, "then take it. Take your pride and go." He felt the world compress to the size of that doorway, the way air presses into a throat when words are too sharp to swallow. Jacob had always been proud. He had learned engines and gears before he had learned to keep a household solvent. Pride and provision had been his twin doctrines. To be told that he had preferred the wrong pride was an accusation that rewired him. While the family argued, a different household churned with an opposite air, cool, controlled, and manicured to a degree that seemed unnatural to Jacob's fingers. Amanda's mansion had a hush like a library where someone had refused to smoke. She moved through rooms that were more like statements than spaces, and she found the life of her twin sister, Amaka, like a collection of repeated notes, familiar and tired. Outside, Emma and Chisholm, the twin sons of Amaka's friendship with entitlement, sensed an opportunity to use the moment as thump. They posted their own commentary in the places where privilege gathers and preens. Words in a certain register have the power to seal reputations. Theirs did. The house that Jacob had fixed with greasy palms became, in the neighborhood's gossip, a stage on which he had performed a lapse. That night, Jacob left the house just before dawn with a single bag and the sound of his wife's quiet sobs folded into the pillow. He could not bear the weight of being the subject of 1,000 small and loud judgments. He took Helen with him because he could not leave the child in a place where laughter had grown suspect. He told himself he was protecting them from shame. Mariam watched them go through a screen of rain, only the weather was dry, and thought of every time she had covered for Jacob, counted out money, stayed awake on nights when the cupboard was mockingly bare. She had told him once that dignity could be more stubborn than hunger. Now she felt both. Amanda received Jacob's absence like a sudden vacancy. She had expected resistance, perhaps some scandal. She had not expected the violence of small-town honor. When she heard the story of Jacob's leaving with his daughter, she felt, unexpectedly, like a mother whose child had been forced upon an uncertain world. She sent for Mariam with an offer that was at once practical and gawky: money for school fees, a flat sum to be given discreetly. Mariam refused. She wanted words, not envelopes. Amanda offered words nonetheless, speaking of being alone, of terrible mistakes, and of a house that had become less a refuge than the shape of her own loneliness. Amaka watched this exchange and felt the floor give way. If Amanda could forgive, if she could reach out and buy back a child's future, then Amaka's place, once solid with small accusations and tabloid resentments, would slide into water. She moved then from envy to calculation. People who have long bartered their dignity for survival learn how to make plans without being kind. She began to twist the household's small rituals, tea times, passing plates, helpings of fruit, into a lattice that could accuse. Her attempt was not dramatic at first. It came across as the kind of care that had always been her currency, offering to make tea, to take the cup from Amanda's hand, to insist on being present when Amanda met with the midwife. The cup, a symbol, became the tool in the fantasy of revenge. But human schemes, especially those born of desperation rather than malice, do not always hold the place in reality they claim in imagination. Amanda felt watched. The staff murmured. Emma and Chisholm became bolder, bringing friends over whose jokes landed like pebbles. Amanda, for the first time in years, felt unsafe within the architecture she had paid for. She called Jacob, once, twice, because she had become irreducibly attached. He did not pick up. She was told that he had gone with the child and the bag. Her surprise at the pregnancy hardened into something else, a protective rage that no amount of wealth could buy away. She had given shelter before. She would not have murder under her roof. The attempt, when it occurred, was clumsy, not in the way that a professional conspiracy reads in novels, but in the bluntness of a woman's panic. Amaka presented a cup of tea in the sitting room with the smoothness of someone returning a borrowed object. Staff noticed a smell, a wrongness, and did what staff who have kept houses do. They spoke among themselves, and one of them spoke to Amanda. The room changed as if someone had turned down the temperature. The marble floor seemed suddenly too shiny, the chandeliers too close. Amanda looked at the cup in Amaka's hand and then at Amaka's face, and for the first time she understood the look she had mistaken for worry. It was calculation, and it had teeth. "Amanda," Amaka said, voice wrapped in apology so thin it could not carry truth. "I was only worried. For you. For the baby." Amanda set the cup down. Her hands were steady, not because she had not been afraid, but because she had known for a long time that wealth should not be her only shield. She called the house manager in front of everyone and asked him to search the kitchen. He did. The mood at the table turned to something that had the stiffness of a funeral. Emma and Chisholm looked like boys who had been caught stealing a wallet. Staff shifted their weight and whispered that they had seen Amaka near the tea tray more than usual. The accusation was not yet proved, but accusation itself can break a life. Amaka denied everything with a ferocity that tasted of fear. "Do you think I would harm my own sister?" she cried. For a second, the room believed her, because that is how the world often bends. We are inclined to choose the version of a story that best preserves our ease. But then Amanda, who had lived long enough to know the shapes of betrayal, remembered the small jokes, the rearranged chairs, the efforts to make her seem forgetful. She remembered how Amaka's voice had always sat in the margins, demanding a stake. The household convened an internal inquiry, a phrase that sounded like a promise of impartiality, but which in reality was a negotiation between temperament and power. Amanda decided finally that she could not live with the shadow of the thing, whatever its proof. She told Amaka to leave the house. The order was not a dramatic flourish, but a clear, cold decision. No more breakfasts together, no more folded towels, no more presents. Amaka packed a single bag, and in her face there was the look of someone who had been decanted from a life and poured into a smaller measure. She left with a train of contradictions, anger, humiliation, a taste of freedom that came with uprooting. Jacob and his small family walked under a sky that made no promises. They had money from a neighbor, a small sum, and a lead from Al-Haji Musa about a room they might rent at the edge of town. Jacob carried Helen on his shoulders for a while, letting the child's weight remind him of the reasons he had chosen exile. Mariam did not speak for long stretches. When she did, her words were practical: school, shelter, the thin arithmetic of survival. She had not forgiven him. Neither had she condemned him entirely. Grief and betrayal sat together like unwelcome guests. Amanda, by contrast, locked herself into rooms that had formerly been empty of surprise. She found herself looking at a small ultrasound printout, the grainy shape that represented a life she had not planned but would not disown. The grief of losing a sister's companionship sat beside a peculiar hope. A child, in her mind, was not only an heir to money, but a test of whether love could be rewritten. She moved through her mansion with a new kind of carefulness, as if each step might bruise or save. Amaka, expelled, did not become a caricature of villainy. She sat in a guest house with a bag of clothes and a heart that had been avoided by luck as much as by design. She thought of Amanda's firmness, of Jacob's hands, of Mariam's refusal. She could not trick the memory of being sister and servant and not sister into anything neat. The world had given her the role she had learned to play. When it was taken away, she found, for the first time, the rawness of self. The neighborhood watched the rearrangements of lives like a persistent weather. People took sides as if picking a team to support in an unending match. Some whispered that Jacob had been bought, others that he had been saved from the slow death of shame by the woman with marble floors. Few understood that Jacob had also been reduced, from the man who fixed engines with the credence of dignity to someone carrying a small bag and an even smaller hope. The truth of poverty is rarely the grand gesture. It is the daily accounting of what to buy and what to do without. Late one night, in a rented room with a mosquito net and a fan that rattled like a heart in a chest, Jacob lay awake while Mariam slept with Helen curled against her. He thought of Amanda's hands holding the ultrasound print and of Amaka's eyes in the final doorway. He thought of being foreign to his own small life. He had wanted to provide. He had wanted to be the man whose children could be proud. Now he wondered whether provision had a price that had been misread as a way out. His shame was a tether. His love was a compass that did not point true north. At the mansion, Amanda watched the pool glass over under moonlight and thought of a life that had been hers alone for so long. The silence of wealth can be loud. It reveals all the habits one had used to survive loneliness. She had money to hire investigators to quiet rumor with carefully placed cash, but she had also learned that not every problem could be paid away. Some things required a firmness of soul that money does not reach. She had, in one decision, expelled a sister and kept a mystery child. In another, she had made a mechanic's life more complex by the simple act of passing him an envelope. Perhaps that was the human arithmetic. A gift blooms into complication. The story did not end with flight or expulsion. It moved like a machine with teeth that reshaped all the small parts. Investigations would follow. Rumors would settle into newer myths. And the people caught in the middle, Jacob, Mariam, Helen, Amanda, Amaka, would begin the hard work of living with consequence. For some, life simplified. For others, it became more tangled. The pool would continue to glint, and the workshop would continue to smell like oil. On a dawn painted thin and tired, Jacob stood under a tree with Helen by his side and watched the road. He had a letter from a small school that would take Helen if fees were paid. He had a friend who could offer apprenticeship work if he returned in the right spirit. He had nothing of the loud victories people expect in stories, only the slow, stubborn possibility of survival. Amanda, alone in the cool of her dining room, folded the ultrasound print into her palm and pressed it to her chest. She had expelled her sister, but she had not expelled the ache of wanting to do better. There was no answer as yet for whether this new life would be kinder than the old. There was only resolve, brittle and human, to protect what she now understood to be fragile. Amaka, carrying a single bag, sat on a low wall and watched the city awake. She did not know if she would ever find a place that counted her the way she wanted to be counted. She had miscalculated. She had also been misread. The world does not often spare those who try to take both refuge and dominance. Across roads of dust and polished stone, the choices made that month would settle into lives like old stones. The baby, real or the possibility thereof, would be born into the center of a storm others had started. Jacob had chosen exile with his family rather than the dubious shelter of envelopes. Mariam had kept her dignity in the only way she had left, by turning away. Amanda had chosen a harsh mercy, to cut the cord with a sister who betrayed her trust. Amaka had chosen spite and lost a home. None of them would be untouched. At the end of that long day, under the same wide sky that sees both marble and corrugated metal, a neighbor walked past Jacob and spat on the ground out of habit, the old way of keeping oneself absolved. Jacob did not know whether he would ever return. He did know the way the world had shifted around him, the way a single envelope and a single cup could unmake and rebuild things. And in the mansion, where chandeliers threw small constellations over the floor, Amanda placed the tiny print by the window so the morning light could touch it. It was an ordinary act, almost laughable in its simplicity, like placing a coin on a table and waiting to see if it would ring back. She did not know what was coming. She only knew that she would be ready to answer for herself and for the small life that might come with her name. Outside the city woke with its familiar noise, hawkers calling, engines sighing, a boy sprinting with a tray of eggs. Lives moved, consequences followed, and the dust settled here and there, leaving marks that would not be gone soon. The question that remained was not whether justice would be served. There would be inquiries, quiet settlements, and some legal rumblings, but whether the damaged dignity of all involved could be repaired. Each of them would have to live with the choices they made, and that living, perhaps, was the clearest punishment and the truest chance for change. Jacob folded the acceptance letter in half and slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket, as if it were a talisman against whatever would come after exile. Helen held his hand with the looseness of a child who still trusted that the world could be bargained with, a small, stubborn faith that had not yet learned the language of suspicion. The school's name was modest. Its fees, quoted plainly on the page, were more than Jacob had on him. He had a friend who had promised work, an apprenticeship that would teach him engines and patience, and perhaps, in time, wages. For now there was the letter, the road, the sound of a city that did not stop because people were falling apart. They walked toward the market out of habit more than design. Jacob thought of the mechanic who would receive the envelope, the man whose children had once served Helen porridge when Jacob could not stretch a coin. He remembered the mechanic's look when Jacob had turned the envelope away. It was not gratitude Jacob had seen, but a calculation that weighed what a man could no longer carry. A little money bought a lot of silence, and fewer mornings of dignity. At a stall that sold second-hand books, Miriam stood with her arms folded around a thin sweater she could not afford to keep. She had not wanted this, not the dignity that required leaving, not the clarity that arrived like a blade. She watched Jacob and Helen from across the square and felt behind her ribs the same tender ache that had made her walk away. She had made choices that preserved some part of herself. She had not, either, found sanctuary. To leave was both punishment and salvation, a paradox that gnawed at her nights. She looked down at the sweater, and it seemed ridiculous to worry about warmth when everything else had stripped her bare. Amanda, meanwhile, sat very still in a room that was larger than memory. The ultrasound print lay on her palm like something from another century, small, grainy, unarguable. Outside her window the city went on. A van negotiated a blind corner, a woman called for her son, a dog hunted a torn wrapper. Inside, there was only the thin, incandescent world that a possible child made with a single quiet image. She had, in the last weeks, rebuilt the edges of her life with the neatness of a contractor, hired investigators, moved money, rehearsed an expression of stoic composure. But the small photograph resisted all architecture. It insisted on being tender. She told herself she would decide by noon. By noon, she had called a woman she knew from the hospital and asked, for the first time with real fear in her voice, what it meant to do this alone. The woman, who had once been the doctor's assistant and had, through the years, tended to women who had chosen and women who had been chosen for them, spoke without judgment. She gave Amanda practicalities, appointments, names, a list of people who worked quietly, and then, at the end of the call, while Amanda listened like a person realizing a door had been left ajar, said only, "You will do what you can. We do not know what grace will do with what we give it." Grace, that word, landed in Amanda in a way that envelopes, investigators, and contracts never had. She pressed the ultrasound to her lips as if it were a letter from herself. In that moment she saw two futures, one where the city's gossip took the shape of knives wrapped in silk, and one where a child learned to speak before learning to fear. She was not yet brave, she was not yet certain, but a new measure of care had taken place of the old measures. It was not pity, it was a ledger recalculated by an unbidden tenderness. Amaka moved through the city as someone carrying a debt the world refused to accept. She had taken something that had not been hers, or she had left something that had been given. Either way, the result was the same: an empty room and the long, slow hours that make people invent reasons for what they have done. She found a job at a small cafe on the edge of town, washing pans and cutting fruit, and learning, by the taste of citrus and the rhythm of dishes, that work could be a way to survive being shunned. The pay was small. The owners were the sort who allowed men with scarred hands to rest after a shift. No one asked her past questions. They asked only whether she could stand through the rush-hour lullaby of orders. On her third night, standing under a strip of sodium light that hummed a lullaby of the city's exhaustion, Amaka watched a woman fold an umbrella and shield herself from rain that came like a confession. The woman looked at Amaka without malice. She handed Amaka a coin meant for coffee and said, "Take this, sit, eat." The gesture was small and unremarked upon, but it lodged inside Amaka like a clearing. She had expected only the white-hot judgment of the town, and not these tiny, unofficial currencies of kindness. It softened something that had hardened in her. She did not forget what she had lost, but she began, slowly, to understand that there were mechanics of repair smaller than apologies and larger than revenge. Back in the neighborhood that still remembered Jacob as the boy who had once learned to fix a motor faster than the town's gossip could calculate, the mechanic who had been given the envelope sat on the edge of his workbench and smoked. The workshop still smelled of oil and the kind of permanence grease lends to hands. People came and went, some to wobble a car that had fallen out of favor, others to exchange news in ellipses. The mechanic's fingers had scars that told a life. He had not kept the envelope long. It had become, in his hands, another responsibility he did not want. He called a man he knew in the town records office and asked the man to look into a debt. Quietly, he said. The man agreed because town recorders are, at the same time, attuned to small economies of shame and obligation. The mechanic kept working. He had children who needed clean uniforms. He had a kind of small courage that does not write itself into justice, but into the washing of shirts and the mending of seams. Inquiry, when it arrived in earnest, came in the form of a woman in sensible shoes and a face that had learned to separate sympathy from scandal. She asked questions. She opened envelopes. She did not always look as though she expected to find anything. But people answer the world in their own time. Some of Amanda's envelopes had been larger than the mechanic's. Some were meant for different mouths altogether. The trail of cash could be obscured, and yet there are always corners where money sighs and falls out. When the woman with sensible shoes knocked on the mechanic's door and spoke his name, he blinked as though waking from a dream he had not wanted. He gave answers that were smaller than the story that would be told outside those walls. For him, there were lunches to pay for and a child's cough to medicate. He kept his eyes on the bench and let the woman take notes. Rumor, as rumors do, followed its own logic. It began to separate into two tribes: those who loved to lace facts with imagination and those who refused to shape their day around another scandal. Some people said Amanda had bought silence with gold. Others said she had been naive, a victim of her own ledger. A few concluded, with the bitter satisfaction of the cruel, that the universe had balanced itself in a measure people could recognize. The town sorted itself into clusters that spoke in low, accurate tones and clusters that invented a chorus to fill the silence. People like Jacob could not easily find comfort in other people's conjectures. He took the apprenticeship because engines had a mercy that gossip did not. They required input and produced results in hours that could be measured. His friend, whose name was Tarek, taught him how to listen to the language of pistons and belts with the same attention a pastor gives a sermon. Tarek believed in work the way some men believe in prayer. He offered Jacob a place to sleep where tools lay like promises, where a single flashlight could be the evening's small sun. Jacob accepted and found, under the hum of fluorescent bulbs, a kind of consolation. The simple arithmetic of labor and hunger met in the middle and produced something that might be called sustenance. Helen began at the school with a shy defiance. Her uniform was a little large. Her shoes had been mended by hands that loved without urging. She read aloud, and sometimes her voice cracked when a new word tasted foreign. At home, in Tarek's workshop, between the sound of a grinder and the clink of metal, Jacob taught her to hold a spanner with respect. He explained to her the names of tools as if they were saints who had performed small miracles in his life. They repaired radios that people assumed were beyond help. They fixed a scooter so that an old woman could visit her grandchildren. Each job paid a little. Each repair stitched a seam in a life that had been rent by silence and envelopes. Miriam found work at a clinic run by a woman who had once taught her to count change. The clinic was small, without the pretensions of larger charities. It was a place that treated coughs and offered a cup of tea, and called things by their names. Miriam's hands, which had known the precise movements of the market and the art of folding a shirt with a care that made it possible to pass a life forward, were good at comforting. She learned to navigate paperwork and to speak to women who arrived with stories knotted in their throats. She did not speak of Jacob except in the way a river remembers the stones it has passed. As the weeks turned, the envelope's ripples continued. Amanda, who had planned to keep the news private, found that discretion is a fragile garment. A driver she had once retained to shuttle guests had been seen in front of a restaurant handing a small man an envelope. The small man, it was discovered, had a sister who liked to gossip. The sister was not cruel, merely talkative, and she carried rumors like a woman might carry a scarf. The city, predisposed to stories that fit its appetites, took up the tale and wove it into every corner where it would fit. The investigators Amanda had paid discovered, with slow professional satisfaction, that money makes patterns. It moves through hands in ways that can be traced. When a newspaper, one that liked to sell more than it liked to be kind, printed a column implicating names, Amanda sat very still and read as though the sentences were moving through the body of someone she did not recognize. She felt, somewhere under the skin, the long electric sense that consequences had a weight. She phoned the investigator she had hired and told him to do what he could. He was courteous and blunt and said that some things could be contained, and some could only be weathered. "If you want to keep the child," he said, "you must be ready to accept that the world will choose a side. It is not a reflection of your worth. It is simply the human appetite for story." There were those who expected Amanda to retreat, to allow a scandal to finish what it had started, by forcing her away from the place she had always called her own. But Amanda, for all her faults and all the ways she had mismeasured others, had never been easily determined by outside expectations. She had made choices that injured and choices that preserved. Now, holding that tiny print by the window, she made a different kind of decision: to name what she could not control and to hold with stubborn hands what she could. She would not, she decided, allow the child to become only the currency of gossip. She would be visible in a new way, not for vanity, but for the sake of another life that did not ask permission to exist. In the days that followed, a series of meetings took place that were small and strategic. There were conversations with a solicitor who spoke of privacy, and another who spoke of admitting to nothing and winning by silence. There were quiet offers of money, rolled up like ropes to clench. There were also quieter acts. A woman who once worked at the hospital brought Amanda a packet of grass seed and told her, "Plant this. It will be something to do with your hands when the world feels too loud." Amanda planted the seed on the balcony and watched, day by day, the sliver of green find its way from dirt to life. It was absurdly consoling. Amaka, on a morning when the cafes were still wiping overnight steam from their counters, returned to the low wall where she had sat weeks before, and watched the city as if it were an animal she did not know how to tame. She saw Jacob pass with a small girl, and felt a pain she could neither apologize for nor explain. She had wanted power and had thought it would protect her. Instead, it had made her smaller, and the cost of that smallness was a kind of loneliness she had not imagined. She met by accident one of the people she had hurt, a woman who had once lent her a shawl, and who now stood across from her in the market with a basket. The woman looked at Amaka with tired eyes, but without triumph. "You look tired," she said, and that was all. It was not forgiveness, but it was not cruelty either. It was a human assessment which felt like a beginning. The pool, which had become an emblem, part safety, part secret, continued to hold its quiet glint. Life moved around it, and yet the water did not carry the stain of scandal like the streets did. Children still learned to float there. An old man still practiced his backstroke early in the morning when the air was clean and the sky only a pale suggestion. Some evenings, Jacob would stop and watch the light, make the water silver, and think of how fragile small human things were. A swimmer's ease, a woman's decision, a child's laughter. He had chosen exile for a reason, but in exile the world sometimes revealed what mattered by what it refused to take from him. The keeping of a child's hand, the repair of a broken radio, the telling of truth to a girl who needed to learn her letters. Mariam, in her new work at the clinic, had a day where a patient arrived who was very young and very afraid. The patient's story was small and, in some ways, ordinary: hunger, a need for medicine, a house too cold for winter. Mariam sat beside the girl and braided her hair, and did not speak of Jacob. She found in that small act that the choice she had made to turn away could rest alongside choices she made now to stay present. Her life was no purer for the leaving, rather it was alternately broken and whole, like a pot that had been mended and then used again. She felt, as she left the clinic that evening, that she had neither the right to be complacent nor the luxury of despair. The town, inexorable in its appetite for stories that fit its schedule, began to settle into a pattern. Amanda's name appeared with less frequency. Envelopes ceased to be news, and instead became a lesson whispered in certain corners, a lesson about the limits of money, the persistence of human consequence. The mechanics' children grew taller and needed uniforms. Jacob learned to tune a carburetor until the engine spoke back. Amaka learned that work can be a kind of mercy that does not erase the past. Mariam learned to hold a life in her hands without announcing it to the sky. They all found in their own ways that living with the choices they had made was its own discipline. One evening, months after the first envelope was passed and the first cup had been noticed, Amanda walked along the street that bordered the market. She did not wear jewels. She carried no detectives. She had instead the lightness and the burden of a woman who had chosen to be seen without armor. She stopped at a stall where Mariam often bought fruit, where children's laughter folded into the air like music. Their eyes met not as a confrontation, but with the recognition that people can be altered in ways that are often quiet. Mariam nodded and went back to her work. Amanda bought an orange, paid with a small note, and left a coin on the stall's wooden counter for the next person who might need it. Later, at home, Amanda would hold the child's photograph to the window and watch the sun find its edges. She would speak aloud sometimes, few words at first, then more, and the act of speaking steadied her. She would not be judged into silence, she would not be defended into cowardice. She had chosen in the end to step into the world in a way that accounted for what she had been and what she wanted to be. Outside, beneath the same sky that watched marble and corrugated metal alike, the city turned, edges smoothed. People learned to live with consequences as with a household expense, not erased, but budgeted and borne. Helen arrived with a careful, steady energy. carrying wrapped towels and the soft certainty of experience. Miriam came later, having closed early at the clinic. She moved as one who knew how to make room for others without announcing that she had done so. Amaka brought water and a stool, her hands steady as those who carry daily burdens without complaint. Jacob knocked once and then again, his knuckles on wood like a question. When Amanda opened the door, he stood uncertain on the threshold, filthy from a day's labor, but with his eyes unguarded. He did not press, he only asked if he could stay until morning. Amanda nodded. There were no dramatic reunions, no sweeping declarations. The house hummed with the practicalities of birth. Light by the window, the methodical wash of towels, a few whispered instructions. And in those small movements a kind of dignity was reassembled. Amanda breathed. Sometimes she swore softly and then laughed, a sound like someone surprised to be alive. Outside, the rain kept time, falling in an even hand. When the child was born, it was as if the room exhaled together. The baby made that first small, stubborn sound, and Amanda, who had practiced speaking to the light that fell across the photograph by the window, pressed her face to that tiny head and let herself be reshaped by the immediacy of needing and being needed. She did not look for forgiveness as might be measured by others. She looked, simply and insistently, for the work that would teach her how to be present. Jacob stood a little apart and watched. He did not touch the child until Amanda offered her hand. He took it like a borrowed thing he meant to return gently. There was no speech that claimed the future for him. He had learned in recent months the patient weight of inability and the slower, harder work of repair. He promised nothing that belonged to tomorrow. Instead, he promised what he could give: steady mornings at the workshop, the fixing of things that used to break fast, a presence that would not abandon. Amanda accepted this as one might accept the weather, without certainty of season, but with gratitude for the day. In the days that followed, neighbors came with food and small practical gifts. The woman at the fruit stall brought a wrapped cloth to line the baby's small bed. The mechanic left a wooden toy that had once been a gear and 2 screws. He had sanded the edges and painted a faint flower across the top. People who had known only rumor and the shorthand of scandal now stepped, carefully, into the quieter language of help. They did not rehearse apologies. They offered hands. Where words had failed, small acts of care took their place. Miriam and Amaka became, in that home, like quiet pillars. Miriam taught Amanda how to tie the small folds of a blanket so the baby would not kick loose. Amaka showed her how to braid tiny hair and how to fold a cloth so it warmed without scalding. People who had known only rumor and the shorthand of scandal now stepped, carefully, into the quieter language of help. They did not rehearse apologies. They offered hands. Where words had failed, small acts of care took their place. Miriam and Amaka became, in that home, like quiet pillars. Miriam taught Amanda how to tie the small folds of a blanket so the baby would not kick loose. Amaka showed her how to braid tiny hair and how to fold a cloth so it warmed without scalding. People who had known only rumor and the shorthand of scandal now stepped, carefully, into the quieter language of help. They did not rehearse apologies. They offered hands. Where words had failed, small acts of care took their place. Miriam and Amaka became, in that home, like quiet pillars. Miriam taught Amanda how to tie the small folds of a blanket so the baby would not kick loose. Amaka showed her how to braid tiny hair and how to fold a cloth so it warmed without scalding. Helen, who had always been a practical heart, managed medicine and appointments and taught Amanda to ask for help as a practice rather than an admission of weakness. Months later, when the baby began to find its voice between yawns and new astonishments, the city seemed to rearrange itself to accommodate the small resident within it. Amanda learned to sleep with one ear tuned to a breath. She learned the economy of nappies and joy, the arithmetic of midnight feeds. She did not become a new person in a single miraculous sweep. She changed, quietly, insistently. Routines reformed until they were no longer merely survival, but a shape of living. Jacob's workshop filled slowly with new work. People who had once kept their engines idle because they could not trust a certain hand came back, tentatively at first, and then with a steadier faith. He did not advertise his own need. Instead, he let his work be the testimony. In the afternoons, he would sit with Amanda and the baby on the stoop, hands smelling of oil, and listen to the child's small noises. Those afternoons were not declarations of partnership. They were gestures of presence that grew meaning by repetition. Amaka found, through her service to others, a new kind of authority. She organized a small group that met once a week to teach other women to stitch, to mend clothes, to make small allotments of money stretch farther. It was practical help, yes, but it was also dignity, a way for people to make the necessary ends meet by their own hands. Soon, a few of the women began to barter labor for childcare, for bread, for hours at the clinic. Pride found its discreet ways back into life. Miriam, whose own choices had been the most scrutinized, opened her heart in a different register. She became someone to whom others came not only for treatment but for counsel. Her steady gaze and the way she would name suffering without sentiment softened the clinic's edges. She did not forgive the town for all its cruelties. She forgave what she could. Small slights, careless words, the assumption that a person's story could be read at a glance. Scarcely anyone asked Amanda for details anymore. The story that had once been a quick, scandalous currency in the market stalls had dwindled until it was a background hum, something that people remembered in fragments but rarely spoke of. When it did surface, it was not for judgment but as a quiet human curiosity, and the town had, by then, learned little rituals of turning attention away from ruin and toward usefulness. Time, which so often disguised itself as forgetfulness, did a different work here. It did not clear accounts, it taught different muscles. People grew better at carrying their obligations without expecting the world to be rearranged on their behalf. They learned to be gentle with one another's edges, to mend broken sentences with practical speech, to step back when stepping forward might reopen fresh wounds. Amanda visited the fruit stall early some mornings, the baby at her breast, and they would speak in the soft shorthand of people who had shared a small history but preferred to keep it private. Miriam and Amanda watched children grow into mischief together, those small faces a reminder that life persisted in its own relentless way. Jacob fixed a rattle one afternoon and handed it to the child, as if handing over an apology without the words. There were no grand reconciliations broadcast on the roofs. There were only breakfasts and the repair of a fence and a letter that traveled slowly across a street to ask for counsel. People practiced forgiveness as if it were a new craft. Sometimes it looked like forgetting, sometimes like remembering without anger. Often it was simply the choice to continue, which in itself was a kind of mercy. Years passed in such domestic measures. The baby learned to walk and then to run, a small, stubborn presence that rearranged furniture and the priorities of days. Amanda sold a piece of the mansion's land, and with those savings and the slow additional income she secured teaching at a community center, she opened a small room for consultations, an unassuming place where women could come and trade skill and solace. It was not a grand gesture of redemption. It was a modest return to a public life in which she might be judged and might, at times, disappoint. She accepted that as part of the price and part of the gift. Jacob married modestly to a woman from another part of town whose stubborn laugh matched his own. They kept separate rooms for the nights when their work required distance. He was present for his child in the careful, imperfect way he had promised, not as a rescuer, but as one who learned, day by day, to be held responsible. Their relationship did not become a tale of heroic repair. It was slow and exacting, built on repeated choices. Miriam's clinic prospered in quiet ways. She trained a younger doctor who would carry on when her hands could no longer keep the pace. Amaka's stitch group evolved into a small cooperative. The women who had once been overlooked now made and sold garments at the market stall, earning not only coin but the steady, regenerative thing that comes from being useful to others. Sometimes, walking past the place where the scandal had once been born, a house with shutters now painted a calm blue, Amanda would see a child plant a seed in a pot and watch with others as something green pushed its way through the soil. She would think of how consequence had been the climate of their lives, how it had not erased the past, but had required a reckoning of the present. The lesson she had learned was not a moral tidy enough to be carved into a stone. It was softer, harder, that living with consequence could teach a form of kindness, that responsibility, when practiced, could become an art. On an ordinary morning, years after the first envelope had passed and the first cup had been noticed, Amanda stood by the same window where the small photograph had once caught the sun. A child she had known since babyhood chased a leaf down the street. Jacob waved from the workshop and then returned to his bench. Mariam leaned over a patient and smiled at the small relief of a life mended enough to carry on. Amaka, with her hands quick and sure, handed a finished garment to a woman whose face had once been clouded by shame. The city moved, no grand epiphanies, no final absolutions, but with a new, patient order. They had learned, each in their own way, that justice in the ordinary world is often quiet and workmanlike. It is measured in breakfasts shared, in fences repaired, in hands that show up. Consequence remained. It had not vanished. But consequence had been folded, slowly, into lives that could hold it. That folding was not a miracle of erasure. It was a discipline of attention. In the small things, planting seeds, mending toys, passing a coin without comment, they practiced a kind of mercy that did not ask for perfection and did not pretend the past could be undone. And so the city kept breathing, and people went about the patient labor of living. They carried their choices like linens to be mended, like tools to be sharpened, learning, at last, that to live with consequence is to enter, in slow steps, a different kind of justice, one that does not promise completeness, but offers, instead, a way to be remade by the steady work of care.